Marshall's new Stockwell 2 speaker is brand new for summer 2019. Now, this isn't just your slight hardware refresh from the original Stockwell. The Stockwell 2 is now a multi-directional speaker that shoots your music out the front and out the back of the speaker, making this speaker a great option if you're someone that likes to entertain guests on a regular basis. And since the $250 Marshall Stockwell 2 shoots music out the front and back, this 360-degree sound is the major differentiating factor from the larger Marshall Kilburn 2, which retails for $300. And also, the Stockwell 2 is considerably smaller than the Kilburn 2. But if you want to pick any of the speakers up mentioned in this video, those will be linked down below. Now, design and build quality wise, even though the speaker has that classic Marshall design, which I personally really like, this speaker is also built like a tank. The entire body is covered in a tough rubber and both the grills on the front and back are metal. But still, you have your classic Marshall leather carrying strap with red velvet underneath. The Stockwell 2 is also rocking an IPX4 rating, which means if it gets wet from a splash of water or if it starts raining, it's not going to have any problems. But I definitely wouldn't get carried away and let it get super wet. But I will say the Stockwell 2 is a great speaker if you're looking for something to take on the go with you, because it's fairly small, it's lightweight, and then again there's that built-in carrying strap. The Stockwell 2 also has an advertised battery life of 20 hours, but in my testing with the volume set at 80% and with the bass knob set to 8, I got a real-world battery life of 12 hours. But keep in mind, if you were to use the speaker with the bass knob set at a lower number, you'll probably get a slightly longer battery life. What I'm trying to say is that the battery life on the speaker is super dependent on how you use it. But one of the things that I really like about the Stockwell 2 is that it charges via a USB-C port, which I think is great, especially if you're an Android user. But the USB-C port on the Stockwell 2 isn't just used for charging the speaker. You can also use it as a USB out port and charge your own devices. So here I'm actually charging my Pixel 3a through the speaker. But I do want to point out that this USB-C port can only be used for power. You can't use it as a wired connection. For that, there's still a 3.5mm audio jack. But when it comes to Bluetooth connectivity, the Stockwell 2 is rocking Bluetooth 5.0, it can be connected to 2 devices at the same time, and it's great for watching videos on your phone because there's zero latency across the board whether you're using an Android or Apple device. And even though Marshall advertises a 30-foot wireless range on their Stockwell 2, I was actually able to go as far as 90 feet before the connection drop. Granted, that was with a direct line of sight. If there's anything between the speaker and your phone at longer distances, there is going to be some stuttering, but overall, the Bluetooth connectivity performance on the Stockwell 2 is great, whether you're using an Android or Apple device. The only drawback is that there's no NFC pairing, but that's not a big deal. But if you're an Android user, you're still going to be getting aptX. So great Bluetooth connectivity on this little guy. Now, when it comes to speaker setups, the Stockwell 2 has a woofer and dual tweeter setup that again shoots music out the front and out the back of the speaker. And I do want to stress that the Stockwell 2 is a multi-directional speaker, which means these are more gears towards evenly blanketing a large area with music. Because pound per pound, if we were to compare the Stockwell 2 to a more traditional speaker like the JBL Charge 4 or Sony XB32, some people might be better off with these other two speakers. But still, the Stockwell 2 does manage to hold its own against these other two more popular speakers when it comes to sound quality.
I can't wait to leave this town, 'cause lately I've been feeling down. The cold nights just don't feel the same. Pack my life inside a car, hit the button, drive real far. But that record only like, I'm dreaming of you, I dream of a new life. Fighting the dark till we see the sunlight. My love is you.
Personally, I think what stands out most on the Stockwell 2 compared to these other two speakers is that the highs on the Stockwell 2 are much more pronounced or much crisper. And that's probably because the Stockwell 2 is the only speaker here that has dedicated tweeters. But even though the Stockwell 2 does have an impressive amount of bass, it's still relatively the same amount of bass that you would find on the smaller JBL Charge 4 or Sony XB32. But definitely, if you're looking for a speaker that gets super loud, then the Stockwell 2 isn't for you. Even though the Stockwell 2 gets decently loud and has no problem filling a room, at max volume it does pale in comparison when put up against these other two smaller speakers. But like I mentioned earlier, since the Stockwell 2 is a multi-directional speaker, its main focus is to evenly blanket a large area with music without having to crank the volume up super high. That's why I would recommend this type of speaker to someone who likes to entertain guests on a regular basis. You'll be able to play some music, but your guests won't have to talk over the music. But now let's talk about the control knobs found on the Stockwell 2. Now, I think it's great that you're able to adjust the sound of your music directly from the speaker itself, but I do think it's important to point out that the volume knobs only adjust the volume locally on the speaker. You still gotta go into your phone and raise the volume there. I also hate that there's no play or pause button on the speaker itself, just a Bluetooth button. So this means that if you want to play, pause, or skip through your music, you're gonna have to do so directly from your phone. Ultimately, this isn't a huge deal, but I just don't understand why Marshall didn't include something as simple as a multi-purpose button. And unlike a lot of other speaker brands out there, you can't chain the Marshall Stockwell 2 to any other Marshall speaker so that you can get multiple speakers to play in sync. And personally, I really do think not being able to pair multiple speakers together is holding Marshall back. So for that reason, I would only recommend getting the Marshall Stockwell 2 if you only want one speaker. Now, don't get me wrong, I like the Stockwell 2 because it's a very well built, good looking, and good sounding speaker with great Bluetooth performance and a very competitive battery life. And I really like being able to adjust the sound of my music directly from the speaker, and it being essentially a 360-degree speaker, it makes it great for entertaining. But if you do decide to go with the speaker, just know that I do think not having a multi-purpose button to control your music playback and not being able to chain other Marshall speakers together is a huge oversight. If you made it this far, I guess you enjoyed the video, so hit that like button and get subscribed. It helps out more than you realize. If you want to pick any of the products up mentioned in this video, those will be linked in the description down below, and you can also support the channel by checking out the merch store. But other than that, I'll catch you next time.